There was a time when the tallest building in the world existed not in the capitals of kings or the ancient seats of empire, but in the middle of America, rising above a city built on swampland and ambition. For a quarter century, from 1973 until 1998, the Sears Tower in Chicago stood as the pinnacle of vertical achievement. 110 stories of black aluminum and bronze-tinted glass climbing 1,450 feet into the Midwestern sky. It was not a palace. It was not a temple. It was the headquarters of a mail-order catalog company that had convinced an entire nation that happiness could be delivered to your door, that the future was something you could purchase on credit, and that the American home was an empty vessel waiting to be filled with things. The tower was never merely a building. It was a monument to a particular vision of power, one that believed commerce and height were interchangeable with permanence, that the ability to sell everything to everyone was a form of immortality. Today the building still stands, but the name has been erased, sold to an insurance company that wanted the altitude without the history. The tower endures, but the empire that built it has been scattered into bankruptcy, liquidation, and the fading memory of a nation that once believed a department store could last forever. What remains is a question that echoes through every floor of that hollow structure. How does an institution that defined American life for over a century, that stood at the center of the nation's transformation from rural to suburban, that employed hundreds of thousands and shaped the dreams of millions, how does such a thing simply vanish? The answer lies not in the tower itself, but in the system of belief it represented, and in the slow, inevitable way that system came apart. To understand the tower, you must first understand what Sears was before it became the kind of corporation that builds the tallest structure on Earth. In 1886, a railway station agent named Richard Warren Sears found himself in possession of a shipment of watches that no one had claimed. He sold them for a profit. Within a year, he had partnered with a watchmaker named Alva Curtis Roebuck, and together they began producing a catalog that offered watches, jewelry, and later, an expanding universe of goods, all available by mail to anyone who could read and write. This was not a small thing. At the end of the 19th century, most Americans lived in rural isolation, miles from the nearest general store, entirely at the mercy of local merchants who controlled prices and selection. The Sears catalog arrived like a kind of liberation. It was thick, hundreds of pages long, filled with illustrations and descriptions of everything a household might need: furniture, clothing, tools, medicines, musical instruments, guns, eyeglasses, entire houses sold in pieces, shipped by rail, ready to be assembled. The catalog became known as the wishbook, and in farmhouses across the continent it was studied with the intensity of scripture. It represented possibility. It represented access. It represented the idea that you did not have to accept the limits of where you were born. You could order your way into a better life. Sears understood something fundamental about America that few others had grasped. The country was not simply large. It was fragmented, dispersed, connected only by the thin threads of the postal service and the expanding rail network. To serve that nation required a system of logistics more sophisticated than anything that had been built before. Sears constructed vast warehouses, first in Chicago, then in cities across the country, each one a cathedral of efficiency, where thousands of workers moved through narrow aisles pulling items from shelves, packing them into boxes, and sending them out by the millions. The company's distribution centers were wonders of their time, pioneers of assembly line thinking applied not to manufacturing, but to fulfillment. An order placed by a farmer in Montana might be received, processed, packed, and shipped within 24 hours. This was speed that bordered on the miraculous, and it created a bond of trust between the company and its customers that felt almost personal. Sears was not just selling products, it was selling reliability. It was selling the promise that if you sent your money, what you needed would arrive. By the early decades of the 20th century, Sears, Roebuck and Company had become one of the largest retailers on earth, and its influence extended far beyond commerce. The company published the catalog in multiple languages. It offered credit to customers before consumer credit was common. It hired black workers and women in its warehouses at a time when few large corporations did. It was not a benevolent institution. It was a profit-driven enterprise. But within the constraints of its own self-interest, it functioned as a kind of infrastructure, a system that allowed millions of people to participate in an emerging consumer economy that would define the century to come. Then, in the decades after the First World War, the country began to change. People began leaving farms and moving to cities. The automobile became affordable. Roads improved. Suburbs began to appear. And Sears made a decision that would determine its future. It began opening stores, physical locations where customers could walk in, touch the merchandise, and take it home the same day. By the 1950s, the catalog business that had built the empire was beginning to seem like a relic, and the stores, enormous, bright, stocked with everything, became the new center of the operation. Sears shifted its identity from a mail-order house to a retail chain, and it did so with staggering success. At the height of its power, Sears was not simply the largest retailer in America. It was the largest in the world. 1 out of every 2 Americans shopped there regularly. It sold more appliances, more tools, more clothing, more tires, more paint than any competitor. It owned insurance companies, banks, real estate. It manufactured many of the products it sold under brands that millions trusted. Kenmore, Craftsman, Die Hard, these were not just names, they were promises. The company had become so large, so diversified, so embedded in the daily life of the nation that its leaders began to believe in their own inevitability. It was in the late 1960s that the decision was made to build the tower. Sears had outgrown its sprawling campus on the west side of Chicago, a collection of aging buildings that no longer reflected the image the company wanted to project. The board of directors wanted something that would announce to the world and to themselves that Sears was not just a retailer but an institution, a permanent fixture of American life. They wanted a building that would be remembered, that would dominate the skyline, that would declare that this company, this system of commerce, had reached an apex from which there was no descent. They hired Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, the architectural firm that had designed many of the great towers of the post-war era, and they commissioned a structure that would be, without question, the tallest on Earth. The design was elegant in its logic. 9 square tubes bundled together, rising at different heights, creating a form that was both massive and graceful, a kind of staircase ascending into the clouds. The construction began in 1970, and it required innovations in engineering that had never been attempted at that scale. The foundation alone went down 100 feet, anchored in bedrock, designed to support a weight that seemed almost inconceivable. Steel was lifted story by story. Glass was fitted into frames that had to withstand winds at altitudes where the air itself became a force of destruction. Workers died, delays occurred, costs escalated. But the tower rose, relentless, visible from every corner of the city, a black monolith that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When it was completed in 1973, it held 110 floors, 4.5 million square feet of office space, and the title of the world's tallest building. Sears moved its headquarters into the upper floors, 3,500 employees working in open-plan offices with views that extended for miles. On a clear day, you could see 4 states from the observation deck. Visitors came by the thousands. The tower became a symbol not just of Sears, but of Chicago, of American engineering, of the triumph of corporate ambition. It seemed eternal. But even as the tower opened, the empire beneath it was beginning to fracture. The retail landscape was changing in ways that Sears either did not see or refused to acknowledge. Discount chains like Kmart and Walmart were expanding rapidly, offering lower prices, faster turnover, and a focus on volume over service. Specialty stores were proliferating, targeting specific customer needs with greater precision than a sprawling department store ever could. Malls were becoming the new center of suburban life, and Sears, which had once pioneered the concept of anchor stores, found itself competing not just with other retailers, but with an entire ecosystem of smaller, nimbler competitors. The company's response was slow, confused, and ultimately self-destructive. It acquired financial services companies, believing that the future of retail lay in credit and insurance. It purchased the Dean Witter brokerage and the Coldwell Banker real estate chain, creating a conglomerate that had no coherent strategy beyond growth for its own sake. It remodeled its stores, chasing trends, abandoning the middle-class customers who had been its foundation in a misguided attempt to compete for wealthier shoppers who had no reason to visit a Sears. The catalog, the original engine of the company's success, was maintained but neglected, allowed to grow bloated and unfocused. 1,000 pages of products that no one had curated or edited with care. The company's leadership, insulated in the upper floors of the tower, surrounded by the trappings of success, seemed unable to grasp that the world they had mastered was disappearing. The decline, when it became visible, was swift and brutal. By the 1980s, Sears was losing market share to competitors on every front. Its stores felt dated, overstuffed, disorganized. Its pricing was neither the cheapest nor the most compelling. Its brand, once synonymous with quality and trust, began to feel old, out of touch, irrelevant. The company shed its financial services divisions in the early 1990s, admitting that the diversification strategy had failed. It closed stores. It laid off workers by the thousands. It tried to reinvent itself with new advertising campaigns, new store layouts, new promises, but none of it mattered because the fundamental problem was not marketing or presentation. The problem was that Sears had lost the ability to understand what its customers wanted, and more critically, it had lost the will to deliver it. In 1992, the catalog, the wishbook that had once been the beating heart of the company, was discontinued. 107 years of continuous publication ended with barely a whisper. The announcement was made quietly, a footnote in the business press. For the millions of Americans who had grown up with the catalog, who had circled items in its pages with crayons, who had waited by the mailbox for packages wrapped in brown paper, it was an ending that carried a strange, quiet grief. The catalog was not just a commercial tool. It was a record of desires, a map of what Americans had wanted across generations. Its disappearance was an acknowledgement that the company no longer knew what to say to the country it had once understood so well. The tower itself became a symbol of the company's irrelevance. By the mid-1990s, Sears occupied only a fraction of the building, leasing out floors to other tenants, unable to fill the vast spaces it had built for an empire that no longer existed. In 1998, the Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur surpassed the Sears Tower in height, and the title of the world's tallest building passed to another continent, another era, another economy ascending while America's retail giant quietly faded. The company moved most of its remaining headquarters staff to a suburban office park outside Chicago, abandoning the tower that had once been the ultimate expression of its power. The building was eventually sold, renamed, its connection to Sears erased from the skyline as if the company had never been there at all. Today the structure is called the Willis Tower, after a London-based insurance broker that bought the naming rights, and tourists still visit the observation deck, still press their faces against the glass and look out at the sprawling grid of the city below, but almost none of them think of Sears when they do. The tower has become generic, a landmark detached from the history that built it, a hollow monument to something that no longer exists. Sears itself continued to deteriorate, lurching from one failed strategy to the next, until in 2005 it was purchased by Kmart, a discount chain that was itself emerging from bankruptcy, in a merger that made no sense except as a desperate attempt by both companies to appear relevant. The combined entity was led by a hedge fund manager named Edward Lampert, who believed that retail stores were obsolete, that real estate was the only valuable asset, and that the future of commerce belonged entirely to the internet. He proceeded to dismantle what remained of Sears with a kind of calculated ruthlessness, closing stores, selling off brands, slashing staff, extracting value from the company's remaining assets while the stores themselves fell into disrepair. Shelves went unstocked, lights flickered, floors went uncleaned. Employees, underpaid and demoralized, stopped caring. Customers stopped coming. The company's death was slow, public, humiliating, a kind of spectacle that played out over more than a decade. In 2018, Sears filed for bankruptcy, 132 years after Richard Warren Sears sold his first shipment of unclaimed watches. The company limped forward for a few more years in a skeletal form. A handful of stores kept open through legal maneuvering and financial engineering, but it was over. The empire had collapsed. The system that had defined American consumer life for over a century had been reduced to a name on old buildings, on rusting tools in garages, on memories that grew dimmer with each passing year. What killed Sears was not simply competition. It was not simply the internet, though the internet certainly accelerated the end. What killed Sears was the same thing that kills all empires. It was the belief in its own permanence. It was the assumption that the conditions that had made it powerful would last forever. It was the inability to imagine a future that did not revolve around its own centrality. Sears had built its success on solving a problem that no longer existed. The rural isolation of 19th century America, the lack of access, the need for a trusted intermediary between manufacturers and consumers, all of that had been real, and Sears had solved it brilliantly. But by the late 20th century, the problem had changed. Customers wanted speed, selection, convenience, and price, and they wanted it in forms that Sears could no longer provide. The company tried to adapt, but it was trapped by its own scale, by its vast infrastructure, by the weight of its history. It could not move quickly. It could not experiment. It could not fail small and learn. Every decision had to be made at a level so far removed from the customers and the stores that by the time the decision reached the front lines, the world had already moved on. The tower, that monument to height and ambition, became a kind of prison, a place where executives looked down at the city and mistook altitude for insight. There is a lesson in the collapse of Sears that extends far beyond retail. It is a lesson about the nature of institutional power, about the way systems that grow large enough begin to serve themselves rather than the people they were created for. Sears, at its height, employed more than 350,000 people. It shaped the careers, the livelihoods, the daily lives of millions. It was a presence in nearly every American community, a fixture of main streets and shopping malls, a place where you went not just to buy things but to mark the passage of time. You bought your first bicycle there, your prom dress, your washer and dryer, the tools you used to build your deck, the tires on your car. Sears was woven into the fabric of ordinary life in a way that few corporations ever achieve. And when it failed, it left behind a kind of emptiness, a sense that something essential had been lost. The company's bankruptcy displaced tens of thousands of workers, many of them older, many of them without the skills or opportunities to find equivalent work in a rapidly changing economy. It left behind hundreds of massive, empty buildings, hulking structures that had been designed for a world where people gathered in physical spaces to shop. Now sitting vacant, too large to repurpose, too expensive to demolish, slowly decaying in suburbs and small towns across the country. These buildings are ruins in the truest sense, monuments to an empire that believed in its own eternity and found itself, instead, swept aside by forces it could not control. The story of Sears is also the story of the American middle class, of the rise and the slow unraveling of a social contract that promised stability, prosperity, and upward mobility in exchange for labor and loyalty. Sears was built on that contract. It offered secure jobs, pensions, benefits, and the dignity of work that felt meaningful. It sold products that were built to last, that could be repaired, that carried warranties and the weight of a company's reputation. It operated in a world where corporations saw themselves, or at least presented themselves, as responsible citizens of the communities they served. That world is gone. The corporations that replaced Sears operate on a different logic, one that prioritizes shareholder value above all else, that views workers as costs to be minimized, that sees communities as markets to be extracted from rather than invested in. The collapse of Sears is not just the failure of one company. It is the collapse of an entire model of capitalism, one that, for all its flaws, at least pretended to care about something beyond quarterly earnings. What replaced it is more efficient, more ruthless, and far less interested in the lives of the people it touches. And yet, for all the ruin, for all the emptiness, the tower still stands. 110 stories of black glass and steel, still the second tallest building in the Western Hemisphere, still a part of the Chicago skyline, still visited by millions who come to look out from the observation deck and feel, for a moment, the thrill of altitude, the sense of being above the world. The building has outlived the company that built it, and in that fact there is a strange, cold irony. The tower was meant to be a monument to Sears, a declaration of permanence, a structure that would carry the company's name and legacy into the distant future. Instead, it became a monument to the opposite, a reminder that names can be erased, that corporations are not eternal, that even the tallest structures are just shells waiting to be filled by whoever comes next. The tower endures because towers are useful. They are investments. They are real estate. They are square footage that can be rented, sold, repurposed. They do not care about history. They do not care about the dreams of the men who built them. They simply stand, waiting, indifferent to the passage of empires. If you walk through Chicago today and look up at the Willis Tower, you are looking at a building that has forgotten what it was. The tourists taking photos do not know the story. The workers filing in and out of the lobby each morning do not think about Sears. The city itself has moved on, absorbed the tower into its landscape, stripped it of meaning, turned it into a landmark that exists for its own sake. This is how empires disappear. Not with fire or conquest, but with silence, with the slow, methodical process of forgetting, with the renaming of buildings and the demolition of stores and the fading of memories in the minds of people who no longer have any reason to care. Sears is not gone entirely. The name still exists. A few dozen stores remain open, scattered across the country, kept alive by a legal entity that bears little resemblance to the company that once was. But they are ghosts. They are echoes. They are the last remnants of something that history has already judged and found insufficient. The empire collapsed. The catalog ended. The wishbook closed. The workers were scattered. The stores were emptied. And the tower, the tallest building in the world, the monument to the height of corporate ambition, the cathedral of the consumer empire, stands silent, renamed, repurposed, indifferent to the ruin it represents. There is a quiet violence in the way we erase these histories. We do not mean to, we do not set out to forget, but the systems that shape our lives are designed to move forward, to replace the old with the new, to prioritize efficiency and profit over memory and meaning. When a corporation fails, we treat it as a market correction, a natural process, an inevitable outcome of competition and progress. We do not mourn it. We do not ask what was lost. We do not consider the lives that were built around it, the communities that depended on it, the sense of stability it provided, even if that stability was always an illusion. We simply move on, and in moving on, we lose the ability to see the patterns, to recognize the ways in which these collapses are not anomalies, but symptoms of a system that is, itself, unsustainable. Sears was not the first empire to fall. It will not be the last. Across the country, in cities and towns large and small, there are other towers, other headquarters, other monuments to power that once seemed eternal and are now sliding toward irrelevance or ruin. Some are still occupied, still operational, still pretending that nothing has changed. Others are already empty, their windows dark, their lobbies silent, waiting for the wrecking ball or the slow decay of time. These places all tell the same story. They speak of ambition that outran wisdom, of growth that could not be sustained, of promises that were made and broken, of a country that built its identity on consumption and is now struggling to understand what comes after the stores close and the catalogs stop arriving and the towers stand empty against the sky. The tower was never meant to outlast the company. That was not the plan. The plan was for Sears to endure, to grow, to remain at the center of American life for generations to come. The tower was meant to be the symbol of that endurance, the physical proof that the company had ascended to a place from which it could not fall. But institutions, no matter how powerful, are not exempt from the forces of history. They rise, they peak, they decline, they collapse. This is not a failure of vision or leadership, though those things matter. It is the nature of systems built on assumptions that the world will remain as it is, that the rules that govern success will not change, that power once achieved can be held indefinitely. The world does not work that way. It never has. The great irony of the Sears Tower is that it was completed just as the company's dominance was beginning to erode, just as the forces that would destroy it were gathering strength. The tower was not a symbol of triumph. It was a monument to hubris, built at the precise moment when humility might have saved the empire it represented. But humility is not a quality that builds the tallest structure on earth. Humility does not commission 110 floors of glass and steel. Humility does not look out from the top of the world and believe that the view will never change. The people who worked at Sears, who built their lives around the company, who believed in its stability and its promises, were not fools. They were rational actors operating within a system that told them over and over that loyalty would be rewarded, that hard work would be recognized, that corporations were institutions you could trust. That system lied. Not intentionally, perhaps, not with malice. But the lie was there, embedded in the structure, in the assumption that a company's interests and a worker's interests were aligned, that what was good for Sears was good for the people who made Sears possible. When the company failed, it was the workers who paid the price. The executives, the hedge fund managers, the financial engineers who stripped the company for parts, they walked away with wealth intact, with reputations only mildly tarnished, with new opportunities waiting. The workers lost their jobs, their pensions, their sense of security, their belief that the world operated according to rules that made sense. This is the human cost of collapse, the part of the story that does not fit neatly into market analysis or economic theory. These are lives disrupted, futures canceled, families thrown into uncertainty. These are people who did everything they were supposed to do and found that it was not enough, that the system they had trusted was not designed to protect them, that when the tower fell, they were left standing in the rubble with nothing but the memory of what had been. And what of the catalog, the wishbook, the thick volume of possibility that arrived each year and promised that you could order your way into a better life? It is difficult now to convey the significance of that object, the way it functioned not just as a commercial tool, but as a cultural artifact, a record of American desires, a window into the aspirations and anxieties of generations. The catalog was democratic in a way that few things were. It did not care where you lived or how much money you had, only that you could pay. It offered the same goods to a sharecropper in Mississippi as it did to a shopkeeper in Oregon. It created a shared material culture, a sense that Americans, despite the vastness of the country and the divisions of class and geography, were all participants in the same project, all consumers of the same dream. The end of the catalog marked the end of that particular form of connection, the end of a world where commerce was mediated through paper and ink and the postal service, where the act of ordering something required patience and trust and the willingness to wait. The internet promised to replace all of that with something faster, more efficient, more personalized. And it did. But what was lost in the transition was a kind of texture, a sense of anticipation, a physicality that made the act of consumption feel like it meant something. The catalog was an object you could hold. You could fold down pages. You could pass it to your children. You could keep it for years, pull it out on a winter evening, and remember what you had wanted, what you had dreamed of owning, what you had believed would make your life better. The internet offers none of that. It offers speed and convenience and a bottomless inventory. But it offers no memory, no weight, no sense that what you are doing is anything more than clicking a button and waiting for a box to arrive. The collapse of Sears is part of a larger collapse, a disintegration of the structures that once defined American life. The department store, the shopping mall, the downtown business district, the idea of a career spent with a single employer, the belief that corporations have responsibilities beyond profit, all of these things are fading, replaced by systems that are more fluid, more precarious, more disconnected from the communities they touch. We are living through a transition, and transitions are always painful, always disorienting, always marked by loss. The question is what comes next, what kind of society we are building in the ruins of the old one, whether the new systems will be more just, more sustainable, more humane, or whether they will simply be more efficient at extracting value and concentrating power in fewer hands. The story of Sears does not provide an answer, but it provides a warning. It shows what happens when institutions lose sight of their purpose, when they prioritize growth over service, when they become so large and so complex that they can no longer adapt to change. It shows what happens when workers are treated as disposable, when communities are abandoned, when the promise of stability is revealed to be an illusion. It shows, most of all, that nothing is permanent, that the mightiest empires can fall, that the tallest towers can become monuments to failure, and that the future, no matter how confidently we predict it, will always surprise us, will always arrive in forms we did not anticipate and cannot control. The tower stands. The company is gone. The catalog is a memory. The stores are closing. The workers have moved on or been left behind. The wishbook is silent. The empire has collapsed. And somewhere in the upper floors of that black glass tower, in offices that once held the men who believed they had built something eternal, there is only emptiness now, only the sound of wind pressing against the windows, only the view of a city that has forgotten what the building was meant to represent. This is how power ends. Not with declaration or ceremony, but with silence, with the slow replacement of names, with the repurposing of spaces, with the fading of memory in the minds of people who have other concerns, other empires to build, other towers to climb. The Sears Tower is no longer the Sears Tower. It is the Willis Tower. And soon, perhaps, it will be something else, and the name Sears will mean nothing, will be a curiosity, a question asked by children who cannot imagine a world where everything you needed could be found in a catalog, where a department store was the center of a community, where a company could build the tallest building on earth and believe, truly believe, that it would stand forever as a monument to its own greatness. But the stories remain if we choose to remember them. The stories of ambition and collapse, of power and its limits, of empires built on shifting ground. These stories are everywhere, written into the landscape of America, into the empty factories and the shuttered malls and the abandoned headquarters, into the towers that still stand but have forgotten their names. They are stories worth remembering, not because they offer comfort or certainty, but because they tell us something true about the world we live in, about the systems that shape our lives, about the way power rises and falls and leaves behind ruins that we must navigate and interpret, and perhaps learn from. If you have listened to this story, if you have followed the rise and fall of an empire built on catalogs and commerce and the tallest tower in the world, then you understand that there are many more such stories waiting to be told, many more ruins waiting to be explored, many more forgotten power centers that once seemed eternal and are now fading into silence. This channel, Empire Ruins, exists to uncover those stories, to walk through the wreckage of American ambition, to ask what was built, what was lost, and what remains. If you would like to continue this journey, if you would like to hear more of these histories, these chronicles of collapse and consequence, then consider subscribing. There are empires still to examine. There are towers still to climb. There are ruins still to explore. And the stories, the true stories of how power is made and unmade, of how certainty becomes dust, those stories are waiting, patient, and inevitable in the shadows of structures that once believed they would never fall.